I keep trying to do a short overview of this amp. My last attempt was 24 minutes. Let's see if I can do better. This is the Vox AC30 C2/C2X. The X just means it has the blues. The one without the X has the greenbacks. Overall, it's a very good amp. It's high quality for the price point. It's got a very thick, double-sided, plated through hole board with good thick traces. Everything's laid out intelligently. There's no bad mistakes like you find on the TBX. There's a semi-minor mistake on the output tube board. Two, really. This is the place where I'd recommend taking to a tech if you want to make sure your amp never has major problems. These 2 points right here are the primary connections for the output transformer, and they're high voltage. And these quick connects go to pads on these boards. And the gap between these pads and this grid trace and this screen trace is too small. And over time, and I've seen this happen, the pads can arc from the pad to the trace. Now, if you have the B+, which is high voltage, almost 400 volts sometimes, arcing to your grid or arcing to your screen, bad things happen. You can lose output tubes, you can burn the board, you can damage your transformer. So the fix for that is to have a tech cut those traces that are running real close to these two and seal the cuts, and then put wire in on the other side of the board to take the place of those traces, so there's nothing for these to arc to. The other thing is these screen grid resistors in stock form, they're 1 watt 470 ohms that are mounted right up against the board, and they often fail, and when they fail they tend to burn, and when they burn they tend to burn the board. I have replaced them with 2 watt resistors mounted off the board, about a 1/4 inch or so. So that increased airflow and the increased power handling of the resistor means they don't run as hot to begin with. They're less likely to fail, and should one fail, it will burn the resistor, but it won't burn the board because there's that air there. So if you have a tech fix this, have him or her do this as well, you'll just have a lot longer life out of the amp without any fires, which is, avoiding fires is good. Now, my previous videos went so long because I got too much into detail, so I'm going to try to do much more brief. This amp sounds really good in stock form. It's well built. For the price point, it's extremely well built. It's better built than the Fender and Marshall amps in the same price point. Now, you can see that this amp has been modded, like I said in the previous videos, my 65 spec values, my JMI Plus mods. You can see there are 3 switches here. I'm not going to get into these switches right now. I'll show what they do in the follow-up video where I play and demonstrate what the switches do. This amp has variable voltage. I'm not going to get into that now. For the rest of this video, we're going to pretend the amp is stock. This amp in stock form sounds very good and is a tremendous value. It does not, in my opinion, sound like a real AC30. And for those of you who've read about this amp on the forums, you're going to think that I'm going to say because it doesn't have a rectifier tube or it doesn't have a choke. Nope. The solid state rectifier with these resistors, and they had the snubber caps here, how they emulated the voltage drop and response of a GC34 was really well done. So it sounds and plays like it has a GC34 rectifier, but it doesn't have the increased heat and fragility that a rectifier tube adds. A rectifier tube draws a lot of current, generates a lot of heat, and is the most common tube to fail in an AC30. So by getting rid of one, they made this amp cost a lot less to produce, made it a lot easier for you to afford, and it sounds and feels great. What about sag, you say? Well, sag is something that people read about in guitar magazines and they think they understand. Sag is an interaction between the ability of a device, and usually in this context, the rectifier tube, to supply X amount of current when asked. These resistors will sag just like the GC34 would sag. Actual sag is also affected by the amount of filtering and a few other factors we won't get into. But crucially, sag, as people understand it, mostly applies to fixed bias amps, the JTM45, the Tweed Bassman, the Super Reverb. Those amps do the sag thing, but they're fixed bias, so they draw more current when you play hard. This amp, like all AC30s, is cathode biased, and it's always drawing an awful lot of current. You can look at an AC30 as either never sagging or constantly sagging. Either one can be defended. It's just not really a factor. So getting that GC34 out, in my experience, is a good thing. All right, it doesn't have a choke. Well, I have built amps with chokes and without, and with rectifiers and resistors, and amps which have a switch to go between the resistor and the choke. And the difference can be subtle depending on the filtering. A choke takes more ripple off of DC than a resistor does. That's why they have this relatively large filter cap here. This filter cap could be smaller in value if they had a choke. If you take out, if you decrease this cap's value with this resistor, you're going to get hum. If you put in a choke, you can decrease this cap's value. You're not going to have a huge difference in the sound. I've done that test. I've installed chokes in this model, and I've decreased the filtering at the same time. And I don't think it's worth it. I don't think it makes a big difference. You can listen to the playback videos I did previously of this amp versus the TBX versus the hand-wired. The differences are mostly that I just had the knobs set a little bit differently in each video. There's no intrinsic benefit of one or the other. I will say that maybe the resistor has a little bit more of an immediate response, but that may just because with the resistor it has a little more filtering here. It doesn't make or break it. It's not something to sweat. If you want to put a choke in one of these, have your tech put a choke in one of these and decrease this filtering at the same time. That's great. There's room for a choke back here. They're not expensive. But in terms of production, a resistor costs a hell of a lot less than a choke, and it sounds really good. So these are not things keeping this from sounding like an AC30. First thing that is keeping it from sounding like an AC30 is the preamp is overfiltered. This amp has ladder filtering, which means from here there's a resistor to the phase inverter node, then there's a resistor to the top boost node, then there's a resistor going to the preamp node. So you've got the B plus with its resistors, you've got the ground, and you've got the different filter caps for each node, and that makes it what we call a ladder topology. Well, that works. That's fine. Fenders have it, Marshalls have it, most amps have the ladder topology. Traditionally, AC30s do not. The JMIs did not, the Custom Classic does not, the hand-wired does not, etc., etc. They use what I call the tree branch. So it goes from here through the choke to here, and then there's a 22K to the phase inverter, and there's a 10K to the V2, and then there's a 22K from the screen node to the preamp. So each preamp node has a lot less filtering in the traditional JMI circuit than it does in here. So I have converted this from the ladder to the tree branch. You can have a tech do that for you. Any tech who can work on a PCB can go there and say, okay, I'll cut these connections and make the connections all go to here. That's not a hard thing to do. What is the difference in sound? It makes the amp less stiff. The onset of distortion happens differently. The character of the distortion changes, and the harmonic content of what you play changes. So that's a pretty big thing. Other places where this does not sound right, they copied the normal channel from the AC30 C2X treble version from the 60s, which is a very bright, very clean sounding channel. And they have limited the gain because they have a 330K resistor in series before this volume pot. So it's like having a volume pot that you can never turn above about 1:30 or 2 o'clock. That's the high gain. So by changing this from the AC30 C2 treble normal channel to the AC30 C2 normal channel, I know it's confusing, you get a lot more gain and a lot less brightness. We'll revisit that when we get to the hand-wired, where they do the same thing, but they at least make the bright cap switchable. There's also a bright cap from the input of that 330K to the wiper, which means this thing always has the bright cap very much in the circuit. Most amps, the bright cap becomes out of the circuit pretty much by about a little bit over noon. So if it's bright there, it begins to get smooth. This amp stays bright. So I'm not a fan of the normal channel implementation. The top boost sounds pretty good on the stock form, but they messed up, in my opinion, the way the base pod is wired. It's wired like the moderns or custom setting on the Custom Classic tone stack switch. It's not wired like the JMI circuit. So when it's you have less mid-range interaction when you move the treble and bass. On the JMI circuit, as I've shown in videos, if you adjust the treble bass slight amounts, the mid-range really changes a lot. They're very interactive. In stock form, this doesn't do that. Any tech can look at the JMI schematic versus what they have here and make that change, as long as you know how to work on PCBs without damaging things. The remaining reason this does not sound like an AC30 is all the solid state stuff between the outputs of the channels and the input of the phase inverter, and that includes the effects loop, send and return, and the reverb send and reverb mixer. And it's not because it's solid state. Pardon me. It's not because it's solid state. I have no problem with solid state. These are really good op amps, really high quality. They're running at almost a 60-volt rail-to-rail supply. The headroom is high, the noise floor is low, the response is immediate. These are as close to transparent as electronics get this side of mastering studio gear. This is well done, with one exception. They didn't keep it unity gain. They have really good op amps being told to increase the gain. So what comes in is increased by 4.5 times by the time it leaves here and goes to the phase inverter, which means that each channel has too much gain. Now they've neutered the normal channel ahead of that, so when you fix the gain here, that becomes really apparent. But the top boost channel in this amp is overdriving with a strap by the time you're at noon, and it'll out-marshal some marshals. Maybe they wanted that for marketing reasons, but that's not how an AC30 really is. And so I speak op amp. I've gone in here and made the changes so that it's unity gain. The signal level that comes into this network is exactly the same as what feeds the input of the phase inverter, and the entire amp behaves and responds like an AC30 should. All right, so speaking of which, with this otherwise very good op amp stuff, they have a very good sounding reverb circuit, much better than that in the Custom Classic. The tank that comes with it is kind of cheap, but tanks are inexpensive to replace. I like the MOD and the Mojo tones. The effects loop is pretty good in this amp. It's not great. It's got a slightly higher noise floor than I like, and you cannot change the level like you can on the Custom Classic. The Custom Classic has a better sounding effects loop, though it has can have the problem with the losing low end, which I will address in a later video on the Custom Classic. But it is also bypassable, and when it's bypassed, it's totally out of the circuit. It has a very good sounding tremolo. It's bias trim. I think it sounds better than the traditional JMI. It affects both channels. It's very much like the one in Princeton Reverb. It's a good sounding tremolo. The master volume is not great. It's a crossline. Like most crosslines, it's not transparent and it's never quite out of the circuit. This amp would be quite a bit louder if this were bypassed. The hand wired uses the same bad circuit with the same cheap 16mm pot, but they just put in a switch so you can bypass it. On this amp, I've done variable voltage, so that pot is out. I'm going to replace my voltage control. On the hand wired, which you'll hear tomorrow, I replace it with the post phase inverter master volume, which Vox should have done in this to begin with. They used the good sounding master volume in their Night Train series. They could have used it in this. A crossline is just cheaper to do because it's one pot versus a dual gang with a bunch of extra wires. But you know, most people don't even know what they're missing, but when this is on 10, it's never really on 10. There's always a voltage divider there because of the 10K is ahead of it, and 500K is just not enough resistance from one side of the output to the other. There's always a little bit of cancellation there. I think that covers everything here. It's got a nice DC heater supply for the preamp tubes. It's a very quiet amp compared to other AC30s in terms of heater issues. I've never encountered any heater issues. It's fairly easy to service. You do have to remove all the knobs and nuts to get the board out, and getting this board out can be a little bit tricky. If you need to get this board out, you have to get this board out first. It's not the easiest thing in the world, but it's not terrible like some amps are. I mean, compared to Mesa's, this thing is a dream to work on. Like I said, all the PCB stuff is great, given the price point. You know, at the end of the day, would I recommend someone to buy this amp? Absolutely. In fact, this amp here with these mods, I recommend it to the owner. The owner of this amp is kind of responsible for me starting this entire process of doing the comparisons. He asked me which he wanted to get an AC30. He wanted to have me do all my stuff to it. He wanted to know which model to get. And I suggested that this would be a really great model to get because given the price of this, you could more easily get this amp with blues than for less money than you can get the hand wired with greenbacks. The speakers make a huge difference, but I'm not a fan of greenbacks and open back cabs myself. But so yeah, I think this is a very good amp that can be made into a great amp that can be made to sound just like the other AC30s. I have no problem with the rectifier and choke or lack thereof. This amp makes sense, and aside from the stuff I discussed here, even in stock form, it should last for decades. So hope this helps you.